Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
Thank you very much. Great to be back again. This is Doug. So happy to be a part of this conversation along with Mr. Cody Deese. Hey, Cody, how you doing, bud?
Well, I'm fully included.
I like that. Being excluded is not a good feeling.
People, we're in the book of Romans, and we're in chapters 9 through 11, and this is some serious business because this is where Paul talks about full inclusion. He uses the phrase irrevocable, which happens to be the title of your dad's book.
Yes, it does.
Merciful to all, and all are saved.
Yeah.
That's strong.
It is strong. And what's interesting is that on the one hand, there's a side of all of us that have been in or are still in Christianity that have been very aware of God is love. And we've talked about it all our lives. God is love. God is love. And we're confident of that. And we try to love others because that is the nature of God. And we're taught to love others. Yet we have this dualistic thing going on in our head, this divide in there that says, yeah, God is love, but by the time you get to the end of life, God is also going to be your judge, and you're going to stand before God, and God is going to make a decree as to your salvation, whether saved or lost. And unfortunately, most of, and I keep saying this over and over, but I want to emphasize it, most of his children, he's going to look at and say, you are lost. And even more than that, I'm not saying all denominations teach this, because I know that a lot of people are evolving out of the hell business, but so many people within Christianity still will say, and I'm going to have to torture you without end. And so then you're trying to align that with God, and you're trying to say, yeah, God is love, but justice is a part of love, as if that's justice, to torture somebody eternally for a blip of time that they didn't get things right here. So the penalty is an eternal non-stopping torment of what you did in your blip of time. So there's this dichotomy, and we've talked again about the Western mind versus the Eastern mind. The Eastern mind has talked for millennia about oneness, that all things are one. Israel was supposed to know, hear ye, O Israel, God is one. The story of God is oneness. The story of God is all in all. That oneness is universal. Can we say that God's oneness is not universal? Where is God not? Can God be divided? Can God lose the most part of that which he created? Is that possible? And if the answer is yes, the only way it could be possible is if we as human beings have the power to make that so. That we have the power to say, nope, we are not going to be part of that oneness. Now, I might not be conscious of it, and I might not understand it, but I can't change it any more than I can say, nope, I don't believe in gravity anymore. I can say that, but there'll probably be some consequences that come with it. So yeah, your thing on inclusion, this is a hot topic today, everybody, and it's why we're having this conversation. And years ago, Cody, I would have been terrified of this conversation, because the first thing I would have said is, so you're telling me that people can just go do anything they want to do, and then everything is hunky-dory. Well, one of the aspects that we're going to get into is the aspect of the wrath of God and the role it plays in choices and consequences that they were making at that time, that Israel was going to come under the wrath of God. We'll get to that later. So we're not saying that, and I'm not saying that you can go do anything you want. That's not love either.
Yep.
So anyway, all these things, I'm kind of rambling here, but these are
not
huge.
You, Doug.
Did we have a script? I don't know.
No, we don't have scripts.
Okay.
The people can tell. You don't have to tell them that.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yep. We'll get into the wrath because that also, there seemed to be a cognitive dissonance between a wrathful God and a loving God. And a lot of that is interpretation and misinterpretation of how Paul uses the word wrath. So we'll get into that. But the other side of that too, Doug, is this, and it sounds so trite and overused, but this idea when you speak of universalism is the pushback of, well, how much freedom do we have to choose, not choose, be a part of this, not be a part of this? And when you're speaking in terms of identity, how much choice do you have with the essence of gravity, right?
Yeah.
It's like you are who you are.
Yes.
And this is the reality of all of us. But I don't think that it takes away from what you see throughout the narrative, which is we get to make choices and decisions all the time.
We do. And the other thing I wonder about is that if, in fact, the concept of being tormented in hell has been used as the greatest possible control mechanism because it hits to the very fear of a person. So naturally, you're going to be focusing on sinners in the hands of an angry God. That would only make sense in earlier generations. And when that becomes the focus, there is then no focus on what is the definition of an abundant life. Do you understand what it means to live a life of honesty, integrity, respect, kindness, empathy, sympathy? Do you understand the depth of abundance that's in that? Or have we so focused on the punitive part of this God that we fail to realize that living a life aligned with spirit brings an abundance that is so many worlds better than a life that is not based on that. And we don't think about it really from that perspective, Cody. And I think a lot of people are, and I actually think that's why a lot of people that correspond with us try to emphasize real quick, look, I'm now part of a non-denominational group. And I agree that a non-denominational group is a great step forward. And we can talk more about that in another time too. But these are the reasons that Paul is writing to the Gentiles at Rome, because they're struggling with these questions.
So it's the saved, lost paradigm. It's the idea that there are strict categories of who's in, who's out, and Paul is addressing this in the book of Romans. And so we've been jumping in to looking at the different verses. And so last week we talked about 4, and I want to jump into verse 6, which is kind of the it's a bit of the controversial, at least when it pertains to scholarship, because they leverage at least 6b to define how they use the phrase all Israel. So we'll get to that in a minute. But verse 6 opens up and it says this. Again, let me just actually read verse 4 and 5. They are the Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and from them, according to the flesh, we talked about that last week, comes the Messiah, who is over all, God bless forever. Amen. And he then says in verse 6, it is not as though the word of God had failed, for not all Israelites truly belong to Israel. Okay, I'm reading from your dad's book. So for those that don't know, if somehow you just randomly jumped on this podcast, all of this is inspired from Doug, your dad, Max King, wrote a book called Irrevocable on Romans 9 through 11. So that's what we're doing. We're just following the trajectory of his writings. But he says this about verse 6 that I thought was interesting. Since all of the above listed gifts or privileges belong to Israel, what about their present stance against Christ? This is a great way to frame it because it's helping us remember the context in what Paul is actually writing here. Does this mean they have been rejected of God, cut off from all the above mentioned things that belong to them, cast out to perish forever? some of Paul's anti-Israel readers at Rome would expect to hear a resounding yes reply from Paul. I like that. I feel that, actually. But instead, he strikes out in the opposite direction. But it is not that the word of God has failed. In what way would his word have failed? By his not keeping or fulfilling his word of promise to Israel relative to the things enumerated above that belong to Israel, such as adoption, covenant, and promises. I like the way your dad phrases that, because it's almost like you can hear the Gentiles as probably this letter is being read, like, yeah, of course, yeah, they're cut off.
Yeah.
And then Paul and you'll see this again, Paul plays this way throughout the entire text.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. It's almost like he beefs them up going,
Yeah.
you with me, you with me, you with
Yeah.
me? And he's like, yeah, no, that's actually not what I was getting at here.
Right. Yeah, he's basically saying what their belief is, so he can then say certainly not. He's wanting to say, look, I understand completely what you're saying, because look, this, and this. And they're all like, yeah, right. And he's like, no. And that's what he's using as the way that he's trying to bring them awareness of the way salvation works and the way salvation does not work, and what salvation even is. So we'll continue to talk about that as well. What is this salvation that he speaks of? But yeah, it is not as though the word of God has failed, even though you Gentiles obviously believe it did. You may not understand that's what you're saying, but when you're talking about some of Israel who are unbelievers being lost, you're talking about ways in which the word of God would have failed. So, yeah.
Okay. He moves in to 6b and says, for not all Israelites truly belong to Israel. And let me go ahead and finish that, even this is verse 7. And not all of Abraham's children are his true descendants, but it is through Isaac that descendants shall be named for you. Your dad said this, for those keeping score at home, page 99. It is apparent in numerous commentaries that 9:6 is the passage most often appealed to for, here it is, restricting the meaning of all Israel in chapter 11, verse 26.
Yes.
And I could see on first glance why they would do that.
Yes. Yeah. And this is, again, this is the whole point behind why he's writing them, because the Gentiles have restricted the salvation that is coming for Israel. And the implication of Paul is, by the way, the principle of salvation is the same for Jews and Gentiles in the entire world of humanity. And once you start restricting salvation, you have set up a paradigm or a principle of saved loss that will allow you to set yourself up as a judge and try to point the finger at all human beings and say, you're lost, you're lost, you're lost. And so the whole point of Israel and using Israel as a model is, this is the way God is showing all of us the basis of our acceptance, our ultimate acceptance, and our ultimate God identity. And so here initially, there's a question about the way that's translated. But again, as you know, Cody, Dad goes on to say that the text itself can be, like most Greek text, interpreted differently than this.
I want to get into that for just a minute, the idea that he talks about for not all Israelites, because this is the problem with universalism, or what Paul is pointing at here, is this phrase all, because he keeps using it again and again, all, which is the point of strict guidelines on who's in and who's out, and save loss paradigm, however you want to word it. But what is it about the human species that loves to create categories of in and out, right and wrong, good and evil, saved loss, And then I want to go a step further and say, in proper context of what Paul is writing about here, the very scholars / humans that argue against full inclusion are doing it on top and in the authority of the very thing Paul is addressing here. I hope that makes sense to our listeners, because it's almost like we get feedback from people going, no, it's not universalism. It is very clear what Paul is saying here. And Paul is saying there are those who are saved and those who are lost. And the reality is Paul's actually saying the antithesis to that, but they're leveraging this text to yet again continue to promote and push forward categories of who's in and who's out. And that's actually the very issue that Paul is addressing here.
And otherwise, why is he even writing this to the Romans? He's not writing it to the Romans to convince them that all Israel is not going to be saved. That's not the problem at Rome. Are the Gentiles at Rome saying, oh, yeah, we believe in universalism? And Paul is writing this letter to say, oh, no, all Israel is not going to be saved. Why? Those that are unbelievers, they're going to be cast out, and that's the end of the story. There'll be no acceptance. And they're going to be found under disobedience, but no mercy will be shown to them. This is the antithesis of what he's writing about. He wouldn't even need to write to them. But the Gentiles at Rome are just like all of us who are trying to understand the nature of God, and it is very difficult to understand how you could be loved even when you are living a life that you know has so much in your closet that no one else knows about. And somehow or another, we think that there is some magic prayer, some magic dogma or creed or something we can do that says, you know what, you're different than all other humans. All that junk you got in your closet, guess what? I forgive you because you said the magic word, sprinkled the holy water, did the baptism, said a sinner's prayer, etc., etc. But you know what? All the other stuff that people have out there in their lives, they didn't do that thing that's a requirement, a rule, a thing that you must do from self as source. They didn't do it. So I'm not going to forgive any of their stuff. I just forgive yours. And furthermore, you need to be the one that goes around and lets them know that. That's why Paul's writing the letter.
So what is Paul getting at here when he talks about, for not all Israelites truly belong to Israel? And he goes on to say, and not all of Abraham's children are his true descendants. But it is through Isaac that descendants shall be named for you. Now I want to keep reading. This means that it is not the children of the flesh. God, we keep seeing that pop up again. According to the flesh, children of the flesh, who are children of God. But the children of the promise are counted as descendants. For this is what the promise said, about this time I will return and Sarah shall have a son.
Yes.
So when he says, for not all Israelites truly belong to Israel, he then goes on a riff to distinguish between children of the flesh and children of the promise.
Yes. And so what Paul is saying to the Gentiles is, you have to understand how your identity after the flesh is determined versus how your identity after the Spirit is determined. And if you understand that God is the source of identity after the Spirit and not your doing, then you're going to understand the manner in which, the way in which all Israel is saved. They will not be saved after the flesh, because after the flesh is by doing. And that by doing no man can come before God and claim to be, quote, like God. This is going all the way back to Adam, which Paul does and speaks about in chapter 5 previously. So the way in which this can also be legitimately translated is this: for not all the ones of Israel are Israel. Now, when Paul says not all the ones of Israel, he is then going on in the next verse to say, not all of Abraham's children, not all those ones are his true descendants. That is not, or his seed. That is not how identity is going to be determined is through Abraham's seed after the flesh. This again is what he has said in Galatians 4. Abraham's seed is not going to be determined after Ishmael. And just like here, he is saying it's after Isaac, because Isaac is the work of God, not of an individual self as source doing.
So that a whole birth scenario,
yeah,
is all metaphorical imagery for you.
Huge.
It is the idea of Isaac and Ishmael. And let's go into that for just a minute, because there's a reason you say that's a metaphorical image, and there's a reason Paul keeps using according to the flesh, according to the flesh, according to the flesh.
Yeah.
We don't you really do have to pull out of, or at least if you came from a blue traditional fundamentalist upbringing, it's hard to see it this way sometimes. But this is where God give us eyes to see this. But when we say according to the flesh, the idea is not that, again, don't fall into the same paradigms that Paul is talking about, which is, Ishmael is wicked. Like, that's not,
right.
We're not talking that. We're
Right.
like a couple notches up on the click to say, no, it was, again, think of it this way, doing and being.
Yes.
And what do you have with Ishmael? You have an attempt, doing, scrambling, kicking, screaming, doing everything in their power, which is the key word.
Yes.
Flesh.
Yes.
Self. To make something happen that was not happening.
Yes.
And then you have Isaac, on the other hand, where it was the antithesis to that.
Yeah.
It was like it just happened.
And there wasn't a darn thing they could have done otherwise. Sarah was 99 years old.
And she laughed.
And she laughed. She was like, that ain't going to happen.
Yep. Because it was ridiculous.
God is ridiculous. God's love is ridiculous. This whole thing, when I was a fundamentalist, I would have said this view is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. Just like Sarah was sitting there going, that's the most ridiculous thing I'm ever. Oh, yeah, right. You're going to bring life to the deadness of my womb. I see. You love everyone. You're going to find some way to reconcile the world. You're telling me you're going to restore all things? Get out, and so this is that response the Gentiles were having.
Paul, I love Paul again and again uses references to the Old Testament. You told me at one time, how many Old Testament references does Paul use in just Romans chapter 9 through 11? Do you remember?
So it's in Dad's book, Irrevocable. There's 90 verses. I do know that in Romans 9 through 11. And I believe Paul quotes something like 38 times. And he quotes from the law, the prophets, and the Psalms.
Oh, the writings, yeah.
And Jesus made a point in the Gospel of Luke of saying that he came to fulfill everything written in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms.
That's the Tanakh. I love it.
And so this is Paul, and why Paul said he came to reveal Christ. This is the rest of the story of Christ and the way Christ fulfills the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And the way he brings that to fullness is to explain that that through him as the individual, the one, instead of the many, God is going to reconcile and restore all things. One of the verses there, Cody, that I think really also helps with this, not all the ones of Israel are Israel, is over in Galatians, the 3rd chapter. And verse 16, rather. And Paul says over there, let me grab it. Now in Abraham and his seed were the promises made. Okay, so promises are made to Abraham. He said that. Covenants, promises, everything coming through Israel. But Paul says he does not say, and to seeds, plural, as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, singular, who is Christ. This is why all the ones, plural, these are not the way Israel's identity, their God identity, is going to be determined. Their God identity is determined through the seed, singular, of Abraham, and that is Christ. And Christ, then, is the one that Isaac foreshadows. Why? Because Isaac came from the deadness of the womb and Jesus comes from the deadness of the tomb. And this is solely through the power of God. And so the seeds, many, those are the ones that apply to Jacob. See, Jacob is all about genealogy, tribes, begat. That's the ones, plural, of Israel. They are not going to have identity through Jacob. In fact, the way they'll have identity is when the deliverer comes out of Zion and turns away ungodliness from Jacob. He turns away ungodliness from all the ones, because ungodliness is what rests in the flesh, which for Paul means ungodliness. Ungodliness is when we humans try through selfish source to control this whole thing of who's saved and who isn't.
And this is particularly good news if you're not born into a privileged place. Because think about it, and essentially what he's saying, you can think about it on this level that, and it translates, again, I see it as clear as day. I try not to take my postmodern, modern perspectives and like eisegete them or cram them into a text, because I do think it distorts it. But it's pretty clear from my lens right now that this is, it's almost like a monopoly of some sorts to say, well, you don't really have an option of where you're born. So it could be here in America with a wealthy family, and you don't really have a choice in that. And, or you could be on the other side of the world in absolute poverty. You don't have that option. You are just born where you're born. And what Paul is saying is, good news, it's not about a lottery. It's not about what tribe you belong to. It's not about the fact that you're in this family and not this family, or you are a Jew or a Gentile. Paul is saying, no, it's never been about that.
Correct.
That's good
it,
news.
Man. It transcends.
Yeah.
It transcends. That's why there's neither male nor female, neither Jew nor Greek. Paul is a transcendent, integral thinker. He is an all-in-all thinker. And when he says all, he means it in the same way that we would all mean all. And so, yeah, this is the way the all. If we go back, for example, Cody, to chapter 5, you have Paul using an example of the one and the many, all the ones of Israel. Paul will say regarding Adam that through the one, the many were made sinners. And through Christ, as the one, many were made righteous. The same many that were in Adam are the same many that Christ makes righteous. And so you have Christ, the one seed, who is the determining factor in the identity of humanity. And now my faith is that. My faith is that Christ has already 2,000 years ago determined my identity. My belief is that Christ 2,000 years ago already determined my identity. I do not believe that I must have faith and have belief in order to achieve identity.
I swear when I hear
That's
you
the
talk,
paradigm.
I think to myself, he's got to be a Christian.
And the answer is I used to be.
Oh.
But I don't denigrate that I don't denigrate that any more than the fact that there are those that used to be in Moses, and there are those that used to go to a temple, and there are those that used to do a lot of things, but we don't do it anymore when we become conscious of higher levels of understanding our loving, creative God.
You heard it here. Put that on the front cover of your book. I used to be a Christian.
Yeah. And I'm not ashamed of that. I mean, any more than Paul was ashamed of the fact that he used to be under Moses. Paul was saying, look, this is all about a growth thing, man. It's not about, we get upset about, he's putting down Christianity. I'm not putting down Christianity. I'm saying Christianity has led us to this point in history. Can we not go further now? Can we not see a bigger Jesus than the one who is only affecting a small percentage of the planet, supposedly?
And it goes back down to what Paul is saying. It's the save-lost paradigm.
It is.
It's labels, it's categories, it's what the ego loves to do the best.
Yeah.
Okay, we're just warming up. We hadn't even lit the fire yet, man. The wood's just like stacking there, and we just poured gasoline on it. So this is still the beginning part of the book of Romans. So we'll catch back up next week, and we'll keep driving this thing forward, and we'll move towards the wrath of God, because that's coming. All right. And I'm quite looking forward to it. Hope you have a fantastic week. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.